In the first two videos for this week, we thought about ideology in a pretty abstract sense. But now, in these next two videos, we're going to get more specific by applying the concept of ideology to the analysis of particular media texts. The examples I've chosen for this exercise are both video games. But this isn't because ideology is in any way directly related to video games. In fact, it's usually easier to read a more linear, story-driven text like a film or TV series in terms of ideology. However, I've chosen these particular examples for two reasons. First, to demonstrate the flexibility of ideology as a method, and second, to make sure that we include video games somewhere in the course. Given the economic and cultural importance of video games to our media environment, no one can afford to ignore them anymore. I'm hoping that after covering this week's material, you'll have the basic tools to allow you to think about a range of media texts and forms beyond video games in terms of ideology. Now, the first example I'm going to address is 2017's Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. While it's very difficult to find examples that everyone is familiar with in our current fractured media environment, this game topped almost every list of the best games of the last decade, so I really hope that at least most of you have heard of it. Breath of the Wild is the 19th entry in Nintendo's incredibly successful Legend of Zelda series of action-adventure games, which take place in a medieval fantasy setting. The general format of the Zelda games is that the player character swings a sword, kills monsters, explores dungeons, and learns how to use new tools which they ultimately use to rescue the princess and save the world. In Breath of the Wild, the game takes place in an extensive open-world environment, and while the ultimate goal is to vanquish the villain Ganon and return peace to the land, the game also encourages players to take their time to explore the richly detailed environment, encounter a wide range of creatures, characters, and societies, and experiment with different ways of moving and playing in the game world. Unlike a traditionally bounded media text, the sheer scale of Breath of the Wild, not to mention the player's freedom to inhabit the world in any number of ways, complicates the suggestion of any single ideological interpretation. Nonetheless, it is still possible for us to consider some key ideological qualities of this example. First up, we can think about the game's multiple currency and resource systems. Although set in a mythical fantasy land inhabited by goblins and dragons, Breath of the Wild contains many elements that should be familiar to those of us who live in a capitalist society. Not least is the organization of the game's social relations according to market relations and profit. For while the game might cast you as a mythical hero fighting to protect a post-apocalyptic world, very few people are going to just give you anything for free. Instead, goods and services need to be purchased using rupees, a fairly elaborate currency system where different colored gems are worth different amounts in a surprisingly standardized way across the fractured world. In order to get rupees, the player usually needs to gather foodstuff or mine raw materials, which can then be exchanged with merchants. In this way, the game replicates the need to work for money that drives our regular lives as well. At this point though, some of you might be thinking, it's just a game. That's just a mechanic to drive the gameplay. And well, that's exactly my point. The ease with which we accept a stable and standardized currency system as a normal and natural part of a society is indicative of the ideological force of that concept, which Breath of the Wild both invokes and repeats. What this is indicative of is that players are in general more willing to grasp a post-apocalyptic world policed by magic robots than they are to deal with an alternate economic system. The fact that it seems unremarkable to players that in a radically different fantasy world, systems based on currency and market exchange exist in ways very similar to our society is indicative of how naturalized our assumptions can be around topics like consumption and capitalism. However, that doesn't exhaust the extent to which we might consider Breath of the Wild in terms of ideology. At an even more fundamental level, we can think about how the game relies upon the classic image of the lone and resourceful individual as the master of their environment. This is a cultural idea that goes back at least as far as Robinson Crusoe, if not earlier, by which a hero, through their hard work and ingenuity, rebuilds the world around them into a form which suits them. Finding themselves alone in unfamiliar territory, such heroes are able, by virtue of their intelligence and raw talent, are able to transform their world from a frightening and threatening place into one where all their wants and needs are met. One of the most important implications of this worldview is the way in which it assumes the environment is there for humans to manipulate to their own end, as an infinite pool of resources that has no purpose or value in itself, but only as a basis for you and your actions. Such instrumentalist assumptions are increasingly troubling, though, in a world concerned about the carrying capacity of our global environment. Moreover, this ideological assumption also reflects the earlier discussion of capitalist ideology, insofar as it is a tacit celebration of the power of the individual. Although there is some sense of belonging to a community, by and large the game is concerned with the actions of the sole hero, who acts by themselves and for themselves, and in doing so saves the world. Such a celebration of the individual reinforces wider social messages about the centrality of individuals, rather than, say, communities, as a site of action, agency, and value in our society. Moreover, although you don't necessarily need to play the game in an aggressive way in order to win, Breath of the Wild is easier and more fun if you do that. And this perfectly demonstrates ideology at work. While you aren't required to adhere to it, instead it becomes a choice that we make without thinking. In conclusion, this isn't to say that the messages of this sort are somehow intentionally planted in the game by its producers. Far from it. Rather, what the concept of ideology points us towards is how such messages and meanings recur in our culture without being the express purpose of anyone in particular. Ideology are the assumptions that circulate in our culture without being thought about, and that's what makes them so powerful.